There comes a time in every geek's life when they have to discuss one of the most embarrassing aspects of being a geek, which is H.P. Lovecraft. Now, Lovecraft was very influential, and we'll talk a lot about that in a little bit. But the first thing we have to get over was the fact that he was an evil son of a bitch. And when I say that, I'm not exaggerating. He was racist in the context of the 1920s, which is when the Ku Klux Klan was at its height. He was racist in the context of the Nazis because he literally wrote a letter to Hitler saying, "You're not doing enough to solve the Jewish problem." So that was in 1938. He would have been a fan of the Holocaust. Now, being a fan of Hitler in the 30s was not unusual. We had people like Charles Lindbergh, Henry Ford, Joe Kennedy and his kids, and Walt Disney, all of which were fans of Hitler. And they were very prominent. So that wasn't unusual. Thinking Hitler wasn't going far enough, why, even some French people thought that was odd. So, and they were 100% behind the Holocaust. So that tells you how racist and evil Lovecraft was. He was also crazy. Now, I'm not one to denigrate crazy, but his crazy was tied to a lot of his evil. His fear of buildings, his fear of the Mongol races, which somehow included the Portuguese, or anybody who wasn't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant from about like 6 counties around London, except for London itself, because there are too many mongrels there. That is the level of racism we're talking about. There are very few people in science fiction or fantasy or literature in general who are that racist. And there are a lot of racist people, thanks to John W. Campbell and his weird obsession with racial purity, but that's an entirely different subject. Lovecraft outshines them all. Okay, the people who he wrote to, people who considered him their friends, like Robert Howard, thought his views on women, religion, and race were extremely problematic. Okay, so, I mean, he was widely considered to be very knowledgeable, but like a lot of very knowledgeable people in the first half of the 20th century, he had no problem with being exceptionally racist. So, let's get that out of the way. Okay, the man was a bastard. And you can look at his work as kind of like, some of it can be viewed as kind of like the way an evil person interprets a good thing. For example, Shub-Niggurath, the goat of 1,000, giving birth to 1,000 young, is a life-giving entity. He interprets it as a kind of cancerous entity, birthing it constantly and flooding the universe with wretched life. Now, you could also look at it as any mother goddess. Again, he didn't particularly care for women. He wasn't gay, he just didn't care for women. So, or any other benign life goddess. But if you look at it through the lens of someone who is psychopathically evil, looking at the creation of life, especially a feminine creator of life, becomes something which you should hate. And he hated that aspect of his creation as well as many other aspects of his creations. He viewed the universe as empty and uncaring. That's a valid complaint. After all, nihilism is baby's first philosophy. So it's not like this is something that most people don't come across and deal with at some level, but he got stuck at that, which is kind of sad because he was smart enough not to be stuck at nihilism. But that also informed his reality. So there could be no benign gods or anything like this. Now, what he wrote was a type of fantasy which we've sadly lost in the middle of the 20th century thanks to the success of Tolkien. I'm not saying Tolkien was bad. I'm saying that Tolkien became all-consuming to a lot of fantasy, especially in the 70s, 80s, and to a lesser extent the 90s, where this entire medieval Norwegian sort of Scandinavian sort of mythology was all the rage, and very little non-Tolkien-esque fantasy was being published. We had Clive Barker, for example, doing some really good work. We had Moorcock, Michael Moorcock, doing some really good work. But most of it, and of course we have Roger Zelazny and his wonderful Amber series, but most of it was, that sold, was focused on a kind of swords and sorcery sort of thing, inspired by Robert Howard, again, the creator of Conan, and one of the people who worked with Lovecraft, and also Tolkien. So this sort of swords and sorcery then informs Dungeons and Dragons, along with a bunch of other things they stole outright, like Moorcock's Melniboreans become the Drow, and Fritz Leiber's characters become source for a lot of other source material in Dungeons and Dragons, which then of course spreads further, and we get things like Dragonlance and the Weiss Hickman books, which keep on that idea. Now, let's go on from there. So, this type of fantasy was often called weird fantasy, and it's a really profitable field. You can do a lot with weird fantasy. I happen to like weird fantasy. The ideas behind weird fantasy are more primordial than the Scandinavian influenced ones in Tolkien. In fact, you can find them almost everywhere. If you look at most, this is In the Beginning, which is a fun book of fables from creation stories. If you look at most civilizations' creation stories, you have primordial deities like Uranos and Gaia, which are not necessarily friendly. In fact, usually aren't. And from them comes a more civilized deity structure, like Marduk after he kills Tiamat. And those deities are the ones that we deal with. They're more civilized, they're less primordial, they're less chthonic. So the idea of like these primordial chthonic deities, like Shub-Niggurath or Yog-Sothoth or any number of ones in the Lovecraftian mythos, those have an incredibly ancient lineage. And in these things, in these early myths, you end up with a lot of these characters. These primordial gods are frequently the gods of the people who lived there before, because let's face it, there's pretty much no part of the world, except for maybe Australia, that was not colonized, and also places like Hawaii. It was not colonized by someone later coming in and conquering a previous people. I mean, no one is native, again, possible exception of Australia, to their land. No one is. And a lot of Celtic mythology, for example, talks about the struggles of coming in and conquering the pre-existing peoples, and they code it as a war between the current gods and the previous gods. The same thing is true in any random mythos you could look at. Japanese, you can look at it, Chinese, Hinduism. Oh my God, Hinduism. Amazing depth, which I will never understand because I was not born there and in that culture. So it's kind of like Catholicism that way. It's one of those things where you can kind of convert, but until you've been born into it. Which luckily in Hinduism, you can be born into it after you converted. Something you can't do in Catholicism. So, or Judaism. So, a lot of these primordial gods become assimilated and so on. So, the weird fantasy Lovecraft was working with kind of addresses that issue by saying these gods are still out there. They're alien beings that from beyond time and space, which isn't a bad idea. And, you know, there was a lot of good work done on that. And still being done on that. Charles Stross's Laundry Files are a good secret history sort of thing. Well, not so secret in the later books, but I'm not going to give any more away. and where they talk about how these chthonic entities work in a modern world. And I'm writing stuff myself about this, so I like it. Now, because Lovecraft was so astonishingly racist and evil, and he put this stuff in his books, there's very little of his stories that can be read without kind of turning off the moral part of your brain. And that's a problematic issue for a lot of people. So, Dream Quest of the Unknown Kadath and Out the Mountains of Madness are two of his best works, and they are the least problematic, I want to say. And I recommend them. You will find, if you haven't read him, that his prose is beyond purple. It's ultraviolet. It doesn't need to be that way. And I think that's also problematic. There's a lot of comic book adaptations, which I think do a better job, in part because they don't deal with the whole, like, the author is a racist nutjob issue. They kind of get beyond that, and they have black characters and women characters and Arab characters and so on. Protagonist of Necronomicon, which is a pretty good old comic from, I believe, the aughts, is... God, I can't believe old comics are in the aughts now. But Necronomicon, the protagonist is an Arab who's a Muslim, which would make Lovecraft dance a jig in his grave, which is probably one of the best things about it. Not that it's not a good series. So, there's also Fall of Cthulhu, which is a very good series, done by a lot of the same people. So I recommend the comic book versions of his stories. But here's the great thing. Lovecraft went on to influence so many other people. And he in turn was influenced by many people. One of the oldest works that he was directly influenced by, that doesn't come out of myth, and by the way, this book is invaluable if you want to know, like, brief summaries of gods. This has a lot of them. It's better than Wikipedia and looking up, like, random deities. It doesn't go into any detail, but it provides a good starting point. So we can look at something similar. The Four Zoas by William Blake, which I'm pretty sure he did not read because Blake actually liked people and was a good guy who was trying to help people. The Four Zoas deal a lot with the same issues. I recommend reading that, as well as most of Blake's mysticism. Especially if you have Christian or Abrahamic tendencies in general. There's the wonderful King in Yellow and Other Stories by Robert W. Chambers, which was a direct influence on Lovecraft. Highly recommend that. It captures a lot of the Eldritch stuff, and it was decades before him. Also working in the same vein, but a much better writer, and also nowhere near as evil, Clark Ashton Smith. This is the first book in a series of his. You can't read this because for some reason this mirrors. It's called The End of the Story by Clark Ashton Smith. It's the first book in a series of his short stories. It was recommended to me by Tim Powers, who is a modern writer who deals with a lot of Lovecraft's sort of eldritch nature, just like Charlie Strauss, and he's my wife's favorite author. And when she met him, I think both her and I kind of scared him away because we were fanboying so hard. There's Stephen King, deals a lot with this sort of stuff. There's a whole host of people who deal with kind of like how reality is, and this is true, ununderstandable by humans. I've mentioned this before, but there's something called the Girdle and Completeness Theorem, that no thing that exists within a set can express the set itself completely. And that translates in every aspect of human endeavor. And one of the things about the Eldritch and the Lovecraftian mythos and the things which are derived from it or that influenced it is something which religions have been teaching for, I don't know, 500,000 years, which is you can't understand the gods. You can't understand the universe. It's inherently impossible. And it's true. It is inherently impossible. You literally can never do that. No human endeavor can ever do that. And to a lot of people, that's a scary thought. To others, like me, it's a liberating thought. But to people like Lovecraft, it was petrifying. So, I'm running out of time. I'm just going to say, I've been Joseph Cadotte. Job Herself is my most recent novel. Fake News is my most recent collection of short stories with other people. Again, I'm sorry that this is flipped, but I have no idea why the camera does this, and I can't stop it. So, I hope to talk to you later. Please feel free to comment,